Did you know? Natural resources underpin economies of most African countries. The share of natural capital in the continent's aggregate wealth is the second highest in the world, after the countries that form the hydrocarbon-rich Gulf Cooperation Council. Did you also know that in September 2021, the Forum on China-Africa Cooperation, FOCAC, will be convened, 20 years since it was first organized? The Zimbabwe Environmental Law Association, Zela, in conjunction with the African Institute for Environmental Law, brings to you the Political Economy Dialogues on Natural Resource Governance, PEDNARG. This is an ongoing series to raise awareness and advocate for the rights of communities and conservation of the environment and natural resources. Get ready to learn more about climate change, energy consumption, local service delivery governance, responsible investments, and so much more. Thank you for tuning in to today's episode.
Today's focus is on Sino-Africa and Sino-Latin relations. We have a rich panel with us today. I'm going to let the panelists introduce themselves a bit later on, but for now, I just want us to take some time to look at who the panelists are and why they're joining us for this series. So first of all, we'll see that our first panelist is Mr. Muthuso Dliwayo, who is with the Zimbabwe Environmental Law Association. Muthuso is the executive director for Zela, and he will be speaking more generally about Sino-Latin relations, Sino-Africa, relations. And following Muthuso will be a discussion that will be led by Eve Nyemba. And Eve is an international relations specialist. And then we'll also have a discussion by Veda, who is a researcher, and her focus will be on the Chinese studies and what they've found on basically the Belt and Road Initiative and its implications for Africa. Then we'll have a discussion by Xinjing, who will be giving us her expert perspective on the mechanisms, the legal mechanisms that can be invoked to take accountability for Chinese investors in Africa. So before taking too much time and before I say the wrong thing, I want to hand you all over to Muthuso to take us through the first presentation and basically the overview. Over to you, Muthuso.
Thank you very much, Bridget, for that opportunity. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, depending on which part of the world you are in. I hope you are all safe and healthy. My name, as introduced, is Muthuso Dliwayo. I'm the director of the Zimbabwe Environmental Law Association, Zela, which is based in Harare, Zimbabwe. It is with great pleasure that I welcome you all to this political economy dialogue on natural resources governance, taking stock of China's Belt and Road Initiative in Africa, while reflecting on Sino-Africa and Sino-Latin relations. As indicated, this is the first of many dialogues that we are having as the Zimbabwe Environmental Law Association, that is basically looking or is responding to the growing concerns that are there over the impacts associated with Chinese investments in Africa's mining and energy sector. This dialogue is being organized by the African Institute for Environmental Law, which is basically a research arm of the Zimbabwe Environmental Law Association. So we believe at Zela that natural resource governance is critical in terms of the governance and democracy issues that Africa is grappling with. I think we can all see, again, what is happening in South Africa. So we believe that that relationship that is there in terms of how natural resources are exploited and how the benefits are shared. That is the revenue that are derived from the exploitation of these resources. So this is actually part of our contribution towards that. So the dialogues are part of the broader work of Zela, the Chinese investments in Zimbabwe in particular, and also Africa in general. As I speak, I think these are issues that many of people on the African continent, in SADC, and the continental level are basically grappling with in terms of Chinese investments. So statistics actually show that China is now the largest economic partner of Africa, and this is set actually to increase under the Belt and Road Initiative, which Veda is going to speak to. While both political and economic cooperation between Africa and China are set to increase, there are, however, major concerns that are rising on Chinese investments over their potential and actual violations of human rights, especially the ones that relate to the environment, economic, social, and cultural rights. So many environmental, economic, social, and cultural rights. And these are the rights that are mostly reflective or expressive of what we call natural resource governance. These concerns have mainly been raised by society organizations and community-based organizations, and occasionally politicians as well, though this has not been very consistent. So from time to time we hear politicians complaining, but most of the times it's basically society organizations and communities that are raising these concerns. This is as a result of the fact that most of the relations that are developed between China and Africa are those state-to-state relations. And that's why we have had less complaints, but from time to time, we have those outbursts from politicians. So as an organization, or simply as society organizations, I think we argue that investment is welcome from any part of the world, including Chinese investment. So what we are not against is not Chinese investment, but what we are against is some of the practices that are there that result in what we call irresponsible investments and that are actually undermining sustainable development. Unfortunately, I think at least the data that we have seem to show that most of these investments that are coming from China, whether they are state-owned or they're led by the private sector, are actually contributing to the undermining of human rights. And we know that China has significant investments in the mining and energy sectors, including Zimbabwe. So our work actually is basically to try and understand these investments and understand how they are impacting on human rights and what can also be done to make sure that we're able to engage in these investments and challenging them, or that is also holding them accountable where necessary. We can't wish away Chinese investments. I think it's a reality that they are now the biggest investors on the African continent. All we can do as society organizations is develop a better understanding, just like what we've done with Western investments, understand the mechanisms that are there that can actually be used to hold them accountable, to engage them and challenge them. So that's what this is all about, this series that we are having. So it is against this background that Zela, through the African Institute for Environmental Law, has initiated the Chinese investment program and developed a Chinese engagement strategy for CSOs and communities. The program seeks to promote responsible business conduct among Chinese investors. Under the Chinese investment program, Zela in 2020 commissioned a research study which resulted in the production of a handbook on Zimbabwe-China economic relations. While the research had several objectives, the primary one was to analyze the impact of Chinese investments in Zimbabwe's mining sector, especially gold, diamonds, and chrome, in addition to the nature and role of its development finance. The development finance is going to be spoken to in following series, but today I think the focus will be on the mining sector. This dialogue series, of which today is the first of many, are part of sharing the research findings under the theme Fostering Respect of Human Rights and Corporate Accountability by Chinese Investors in Africa's Mining and Energy Sector. As I said, we are not opposed to investment, but we want this investment to be done responsible. And what is the responsible investment? It's investment that respect rights like environmental, economic, social, and cultural rights. And we also agree that in any form of business, there's that possibility or a potential for human rights to be violated. But what is also most important is when this happens, what mechanisms are there to hold those that are responsible accountable? What are the opportunities that are there for participation, for getting access to information, which is critical in terms of accountability? So the objectives of today's dialogue are as follows: to share national and regional lessons and experience on Chinese investments, its impact on socioeconomic and environmental rights of communities. I know that there are a number of organizations that are working on these issues. The Southern Africa Resource Watch is one of them, the African Coalition on Corporate Accountability, and many other CSOs that are also programming on these issues. So we hope that will be able to share experience in terms of what is happening in Zimbabwe, in terms of what is happening within the region, and also what is happening at the continental level, so that we are able to develop strategies that can help us understand better and hold those that are responsible for the violations of these rights accountable. We also hope to come up with an effective engagement and advocacy strategy, or strategies that can help in fostering corporate accountability of Chinese investors in Africa's mining sector. We also hope that this could also lay a platform to build a movement or a network that is going to be useful in terms of holding, or that is going to be helpful in terms of promoting corporate accountability of Chinese investors in the mining sector. As I have already indicated, a number of organizations are already working on these issues. So we hope that this can lay that foundation for that network where we can exchange ideas, views, and strategies. Then lastly, we hope to facilitate the development of a research agenda around Chinese investments in Africa's mining and energy sector. I think there are various issues there that can actually be researched on. It could be from an environmental perspective, labor perspective, economic perspective, or even political perspective. And hopefully we can use that to generate a body of knowledge that will enable us to have that better understanding of Chinese investments and the mechanisms that are available in terms of holding them accountable. So out of these objectives, the following are the expected outcomes: increased knowledge and awareness amongst practitioners on the socioeconomic and environmental impact of Chinese investments in Africa. And this could actually be positive or negative. So we leave it out there in terms of what is going to come out to see whether the impacts are negative or positive. Then the development of regional action plan and engagement strategy on fostering corporate accountability, Chinese investments in Africa's mining and energy sector. Then we also hope to establish a coordinated network of practitioners work on fostering corporate accountability of Chinese investments in Africa's mining and energy sectors. So that's what we hope to achieve from this dialogue, which I said is the beginning of many, and the following ones will be able to build on this. With these few remarks, I wish all of us great deliberations on this very topical issue. We have experts in this area who will lead us in our conversations, and these include Veda, who was actually involved in terms of supervising the research that we did as the Environmental Law Association. Then Eve also participated as a research as well, so they'll be able to share their expertise and experience. Then of course, Xinjing is a colleague that we've worked with on many occasions on these issues, and we're also in the process of collaborating on a number of other issues. Most importantly as well, I also hope that the participants will also be able to participate actively and share their experiences and their expertise as well. As I said, Zela does not have a monopoly in terms of this subject matter. There are a number of other organizations that are also already working on this, and we hope to hear from your experiences, what you have seen happening. And I think once we do that, we'll be able to achieve the desired objectives of this meeting. Thank you very much, Bridget, and back to you.
Thank you so much, Muthuso, for that very eye-opening introduction. We look forward to this platform being the first of many, as you have mentioned, and we're also looking forward to that wonderful research agenda crafting, as well as the networking of practitioners, so that this becomes that platform that you said to be a platform that promotes accountability on both the investor and the government. So right now, I'm going to hand over to Veda, who's going to speak about the Belt and Road Initiative, what it is and what its implications are. Veda has curated and led transnational multicultural teams in projects examining Chinese and Indian engagements in various African countries. She specializes in gathering grassroots perspectives to conduct evidence-based research to inform policy. And Veda has also co-edited that handbook that Muthuso referred to, which is called the Handbook on Zimbabwe-China Economic Relations. It's a 2021 publication by Zela. Over to you, Veda.
Thank you so much, Bridget. Thank you so much for that introduction. It's a pleasure to be here. I've actually had the good fortune of working closely with Zela over the past year and with the researchers at Zela on the handbook that Muthuso was referring to. And I'm really excited to listen to other panelists and also listen to the other talks that are going to be part of this series. But today, my presentation is going to be about China's Belt and Road Initiative. And this is largely going to be informed by a study we did at the Institute of Chinese Studies, which is a research institute in New Delhi, where we looked at China's infrastructure development in Africa. So what we did essentially was we took case studies from Tanzania and Kenya. We tied up with research organizations in these countries and with researchers as well. We conducted exhaustive fieldwork and we came out with the findings. But the format that I'll be following for today's presentation is essentially this. What is the BRI? Why is the BRI important to Africa? Why is Africa important to the BRI? And what is the pushback for the BRI in Africa? What are the challenges? Some of which Muthuso has already sort of referred to. We'll go over some others as well. But before I start, I just want to say this quote by Jonathan Hillman, who says, mapping the BRI is part art, part science. It's a moving target, loosely defined and ever expanding. So you will see that you will find different kinds of numbers. You'll find contrasting points of view. And all of that is sort of part of scholars trying to, define what the BRI is. So essentially, some of the basics, it's China's main international cooperation and economic strategy. It's been called by many names before, but in Chinese, it's Ita-Ilu. It was introduced by President Xi Jinping in 2013, and it was incorporated into the party constitution during the 19th National Party Congress in 2017. And since then, it's become a fulcrum of China's geopolitics. But the idea, the purpose, the concept, and the agenda for the BRI, it mutates and takes on many forms depending on who's describing it. For instance, this particular Chinese scholar says that it is a new world order with Chinese characteristics. So from mirroring the romantic notion of the old Silk Road and reviving trade routes to being perceived as a Marshall Plan of sorts, a tool of statecraft, economic diplomacy, a Chinese conspiracy, a global domination strategy, an instrument to achieve the Chinese dream, to an outlet for Chinese overcapacity and for its cooperations to go completely global, the descriptions of the BRI are multiple. So it largely depends on who you ask and where you're looking at. But what we do know is this, that the geographical scope of the BRI is constantly expanding. But the latest numbers that I could find, around 140 countries have signed MOUs with China. The overall investments are close to 200 billion. But again, like I mentioned, you'll find extreme variations in this number. The main sectors, though, which get the most number of investments are energy and transport. So, and within energy, in the last year, most of the investments have gone into the renewable sector, like solar, hydro, and so on. And within transport, it's airports, railroads, ports, and so on. The main lenders of the BRI projects are the Chinese Exim Bank and the CDB. The main partners for the BRI are state-owned enterprises. The only non-state-owned enterprise that I could see was the Alibaba Group, which has come 15th in the picture that I've just put up. So as this picture shows, this is a photo from Merix, which is a research institute in Germany, where they are tracking the BRI. As you'll see, it has a Silk Road economic belt. It has a maritime Silk Road. It has railroads, oil pipelines, gas pipelines, ports, and so on. And according to this, by region, you'll see that in sub-Saharan Africa, 40 countries have already signed memorandums of understandings to be part of the BRI. So why is the BRI important for Africa? So studies show that poor connectivity is impeding African growth. There's obviously a lot of literature on this, and also a lot of literature examining the infrastructure gap, which is estimated to be around 130 to 170 billion on the continent. And so far, the BRI investments into Africa have accounted for 53 billion. And obviously, therefore, the countries in the region stand to gain tremendously from this point of view. Estimates from Aid Data, which is another database brought out by the College of William and Mary, point out that China has already built over 3,000 large critical infrastructure projects, over 6,200 kilometers of railways, and trained 160,000 local people. But why is Africa important to the BRI? So there is this document called the China-Africa Action Plan. I encourage you to read it if you are interested in China-Africa relations. It's a document that was adopted under FOCAC, And if you look at it closely, it's mentioned the BRI 12 times, right? And what was really interesting to me was it was brought up in different contexts. And I think this highlights the shape-shifting nature of the BRI, that the definition isn't set in stone. So just to give you a perspective on what, how they sort of, the Chinese define Africa fitting into the BRI definitions. This document declares that the BRI is in line with the AU Agenda 2063. It points to the centrality of African nations to the project, as well as the similarity of the BRI and the AU's development goals. It is presented as a cooperation mechanism that would underline the spirit of Beijing Declaration and help build a strong China-Africa community. But it was also touted as a mechanism that would enhance cooperation and security, as well as science, technology, innovation. One that would improve international legal systems and expand the scope of legal systems in countries involved in the BRI. It also says that BRI as a driver would create new financing models, improve the terms and conditions of credit to support projects under its realm. African nations were recognized as important partners that were to jointly build the road with China. So therefore, what has happened in the African context is that they've linked the BRI to not only the continent's overall development agenda, but also to the infrastructure development plans of individual countries. I think the main point that we should take away from this is that there are two main reasons why Africa becomes really important to the Chinese BRI, right? The first is in creating this narrative of the benign BRI. So as all of you already know, there are serious challenges when it comes to debt, the sustainability of debt. There are questions about environmental safeguards. There are questions about labor policies. There are questions around the amount of political influence China has in recipient countries, and also the questions of what happens when several of these countries are not able to refurbish loans. So African voices become important when it comes to countering a larger so-called Western narrative of the BRI being an unsustainable operation. It also becomes important because a lot of African leaders have been very vocally supportive of the BRI and the benefits of the BRI. But what's been really interesting is that we've seen several cases where the African agency has sort of stepped in to negotiate better deals. And that's, I think, the crux of what we are trying to do here today, to sort of emphasize the importance of the African agency. Like, for instance, if I was to give you an example, I remember speaking to contractors at the CCCC, which is a Chinese SOE, and they were building the Nairobi-Mombasa SGR. And they had mentioned that, a lot of animals, because the SGR, the railway track, passes through the Tsavo National Park, it was affecting a lot of the animals in the national park, and a lot of environmental groups were up in arms against it, and rightfully so. So the Chinese company was forced to build these particular sections of the railway line at around 58 to 60 meters height, something that they had not done before, because there was pushback against what their original plan was. Similarly, we also saw Sierra Leone, which was one of the first African countries to cancel a BRI project because an airport, if I'm not mistaken, because the loan amounts were too much. So we actually see, and there are examples from Ghana and Gambia and so on. So when I speak to African economists, like I remember speaking to James Shikwati, and he mentioned that, debt is not the problem. The problem is the mismanagement of debt. So fundamentally, when we ask a very simple question, is the BRI good for Africa? On theory, on paper, it seems to be. But I think the onus lies on African agencies. And I'm not just talking about African governments, I'm talking about civil society organizations and subnational entities to really ensure that the negotiations and ensure that the best sort of deal is struck. So the onus of that falls on the African agency. And that's what I would sort of end with, sort of underlining the importance of the African agency to create a China strategy. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Vida. Thank you so much for that. So essentially, you're letting us know that the BRI is a moving target and we have a lot to learn. And so without taking up too much time, I would like to move on to the next speaker, who is Xinjing. Xinjing is an environmental lawyer. She Actually, let me restate that. Xinjing is a prominent Chinese environmental lawyer, a lecturer in the law at the University of Maryland School of Law, and the founder of the Center for Transnational Environmental Accountability, CTEA. Her work involves testing various legal avenues to ensure that Chinese companies under China's Belt and Road Initiative comply with environmental laws and international human rights norms in Africa and Latin America. Welcome, Xinjing. The floor is yours.
So
thank you.
hi
Everyone,
for
inviting me
Zhang
to be
in
speaker
Chinese.
here.
Zhang Xinjing, and I'm an environmental lawyer. I practice Chinese law, and I work for Chinese First Environmental Law Group, Center for Legal Assistance to Pollution Victims. And that is China's first environment group, and I was a litigation director. So basically my work is to hold Chinese company accountable. That is my whole career is about. And now I'm, even though I'm living outside China, I'm still working on the China-related issue. Thanks for Veda introduce BRI, so I don't need to spend the time to explain what BRI is. I think each of us have a different piece of the BRI, our understanding, our personal understanding of the BRI. BRI is a big concept or the ideology what the China want to promote to the world, and each of us have our different perspective about what BRI is. And what I'm going to talk is just one aspect of the BRI, the core piece of the BRI, Federal Initiative, the investment, the outbound, China's outbound investment. So here, I'd like to discuss what the governance and regulation accountability looks like regarding the outbound investment in China under the BRI or beyond the BRI. So as you heard, BRI was announced in 2013. That is a big ambition plan for China to promote this new idea connection and the investment to infrastructure project globally. But China's outbound investment, outbound capital flow was much earlier than the BRI was announced. And back in the year of the 2000, China had the policy called Go Global, Go Out and Go Global policy, that, which is to urge Chinese companies, include SOE and the private companies, go out to pursue the profit and bring back the natural resource to fuel China's domestic and economic development. So my point is the outbound investment from China is much earlier than the Belt Initiative was announced. And we do have the governance regime regarding the China's outbound investment, but compare with our inward foreign direct investment, the governance, the regulation, the legal system on the outbound investment is still weak. And I missed some issue here. There is a list of the Chinese government department which have a mandate to regulate and manage China's outbound investment. And you can see the National Development and Reform Commission, in short, the NDRC, Ministry of the Commerce, MOFCOM, and China's International Cooperation and Development Agency. This new agency was formed in 2018. And the State-Owned Asset and Supervision and Administration Commission, which is to regulate China's state-owned enterprise. And we have a state administration foreign exchange. It's managed of our foreign the currency exchange. So those are government agencies have a mandate to manage and regulate the outbound investment. But I want to emphasize, you see, this is a ministry which we thought has a mandate, but doesn't, which is the Ministry of the Ecology and the Environment. So that means during the process of the approving Chinese outbound investment project, which is required, either the company needs register, record, or get approval from those government agency I listed above. And in that process, there's no requirement of the screening requirement of the environment impact, the climate impact, and human rights impact. There's no such process, and there's no legal requirement. And China's environment impact assessment laws only apply to the environmental matters within China's territory. That is very clear and expressed in our EIA law. And we do have a lot of regulations, and I list many of them, but it's just too detailed for you guys to read each of them. But what I want to say, we do have measures and some regulations, but they are no rank. They are not laws. They are not law made by China's People's Congress. They are all measures made by the various government agencies themselves. They are regulation under China's legislative law, but they can only regulate certain issues from a certain perspective, and there is no overarching regulation and law to manage all the aspects of the Chinese overseas investment, especially if we don't have an environment requirement regarding the outbound investment law. That is what the work I'm doing, the legislative change we are advocating for. China need to expand the EIA environment impact assessment law to the matter of the outbound investment. That is what I'm exactly doing right now. And I also want to show Chinese government and various business associations made a lot of guidance and guidelines. And some people call them soft laws, but I want to remind you, they are not laws. They just provide guidance for the Chinese companies to follow. If Chinese companies or SOEs, private company, and they don't follow, there's no legal consequences. And I didn't see the economic incentive for them to comply with either. So there's no incentive and no enforcement. And what do you expect the Chinese company will do? Voluntarily comply with it. And it's hard for the business when there is a profit and there is guidance, what they will choose. So the guidance, just those government guidance and the guidelines provide certain guides, but that won't impose any legal responsibility and liability on Chinese companies. Then, some business guidance have learned from the good practice, international good practice, like the CCCMC made due diligence guidance for responsible mineral supply chain, which they learned a lot from the OECD guidance, and those are very good guidance, but the major issue is there's no enforcement, and it's just too soft to be enforced. And most Chinese companies, they either don't know, or they are not willing to follow those guidance. And that is a big issue on the soft laws, we got the guidance. And now you want heard about the mechanism, accountability mechanism. I start from this the non-state-based and non-judicial mechanism, because many of you know, if you have done any work regarding the World Bank investment, or those Western-based development banks invest project, you may know there's a bank-based, financial institute-based grievance mechanism like World Bank, and I've seen those World Bank groups. They already built their own internal grievance mechanism. They have their environment safeguards and very cleanly set up. But in China, there is only one financial institution, AIIB, Asian Infrastructure Industry Bank, has made its announced its environmental social safeguards, as well as the internal mechanism, grievance mechanism, which allow the community to submit a petition regarding the AIB's making decision. But so far, we haven't seen any cases, any case yet. There's no any ongoing case. There's no any case has been accepted. Petition has been accepted by the AIB, even though it was announced in 2000. That mechanism was announced for a couple of years. And no other Chinese banks has made the grievance mechanism. So that, I think, made it's very difficult for the community, affected community, to voice their concern and to send the message to the banks. There's no such channel for them to use. And so that is a fact. And we also have the state-based non-judicial mechanism that you can find in your or country, in Zimbabwe, in other African countries, like neighbor issue and consumer protection body. Those mechanisms are quite universal in many countries. In China, we do have very special mechanism we call the Xinjing, the letters and the call. That is a mechanism for the Chinese citizens to use if the government wrongdoing, the wrongdoing affect their rights, and they can use the letters and the call. We have to have a regulation to frame these letters and calls. But it's a mechanism hardly to be used by non-Chinese citizens or community or CSOs. It's very domestic system. So even though I mentioned here, I don't think you can use it, and it's not designed associate target to the BRI outbound investment. And then I want to talk this most important mechanism, the state-owned judicial mechanism, the court. Can we file litigation, a lawsuit, and the Chinese court, like we see in U.S. the alien tort case, and what we see in Europe, like the U.K. and Netherlands. Recently, some of you, if you are a lawyer, if you follow this transnational accountability issue, you may know this winning case in Netherlands. The court made a judgment verdict, asked the Shell Nigeria and the parent company Royal Dutch Shell pay the compensation to the farmers in Nigeria. So that kind of case, can that kind of case happen in China? And we didn't see any of the such a case happened in China, has been filed in China yet, but we do see China set up this China International Commercial Court, CICC, and the court is built to serve the goal to promote Belt Road Initiative. This is the first page I download, and you see it very clearly express the China International Commercial Court is served to proponent the Belt Road Initiative and with the rule of law. And I know some of you may doubt it, but that is the mechanism, the judicial branch, and decide to serve the BRI. And it's a commercial court, so which means it will solve the dispute on the BRI and under the contractual dispute, and we didn't see the clear definition or rules if the tort case mostly are like environment issue, labor rights issue, and other human rights issue. Those cases can be accepted by this court. It's still a question because all those cases have to meet the requirement under China civil civil procedure law and other procedural requirements, and this court can not make its own procedural rule which violate China's cannot comply with the procedural requirements. But you can see here some cases mentioned by the court. If this subject matter in dispute is outside China's territory, and it could be considered, there are 4 factors to be considered as a case accepted by this court. And the court is also claim it promotes the connectivity of the litigation, mediation, and arbitration. So it's a claim it's a one-stop dispute resolution platform. So I still doubt if one court can play a role to mediate and to arbitrate and or to try the dispute. Still a big issue for me, and I doubt it seriously. But it is has expressed a one-stop solution. And then you see there is some signal was released by the Chinese Supreme Court, said in a judicial opinion announced in 2019, the end of 2019, the Supreme Court of China said it will improve mechanisms for preventing and responding to environmental risk in the overseas investment and the cross-border trade, and strengthen the research on the environment protection law. And so all this article in the Supreme Court's Barrow judicial opinion number 2 gave a signal to all of us. China may accept the case associated, the environmental tort case associated with China's outbound investment project, but we haven't seen any cases yet, and that is it's also my goal. And to use this article and to work with Zela and other like-minded environment organization to file a case for the community which is affected by the Chinese overseas investment. So that is a goal, but we haven't succeeded yet. The last one is regional international grievance mechanism. Some of you already know, but I always want to emphasize. The UN human rights mechanism is one. We have the UPR, the 5-year cycle, and it's approaching. The next cycle of the China's UPR is approaching, and this year is China's the review, the national review under the ESCR, the International Covenant on the Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, and it's a time you can use UN human rights mechanism to address some issue in your country. So that is another additional avenue you could think about. So that is all. That is my presentation.
Wow, such a rich presentation, Xinjing. Thank you so much. We look forward to engaging with you some more on this. We've learned a lot about the complaints and grievance mechanisms, and especially your mention on the CICC. We look forward to engaging with you on that. And basically, I agree with you. What kind of a court is a one-stop solution, right? Yeah. So moving right along, we're going to have a presentation from Eve Nyemba. Eve is going to speak to us today about the Zim-Sino relations. And Eve is an international relations specialist. Her analytical mind focuses on foreign policy, diplomacy, international organizations, administration, gender and politics, and in-depth country analysis, politics, and governance in developing societies. Eve has published on foreign affairs, democratic governance, and international relations, and she's also authored 2 of the chapters that were mentioned in the book Handbook on Zimbabwe-China Economic Relations, which is a 2021 publication by the Zimbabwe Environmental Law Association. Eve Nyemba, please take the floor.
Thank you very much, Bridget, for that introduction. I'm going to be giving an overview of China-Zimbabwe relations, and I'm going to be basically discussing the findings from the research that we did and the contribution that I made to the Handbook of Zimbabwe-China Economic Relations. I would like to thank Zela for the opportunity, and I would like to thank my predecessors for giving such eye-opening presentation. My presentation basically will provide an analysis of the political, military, social, economic, and diplomatic strategic relations that exist between China and Zimbabwe. So I'll start with an historical overview of China-Zimbabwe relations so that we get into context about the present day China-Zimbabwe relations. So we are also going to examine the current state of the Sino-Zimbabwe relations, including Chinese aid, trade, and investments under the new dispensation. We are also going to look at China-Zimbabwe COVID-19 diplomacy. So that is basically how my presentation is going to take shape. And I'm also going to discuss briefly about the Look East policy, which also then shapes the current policy that we now have of engagement and re-engagement with international partners. So I'll start with the military relations. The cooperation between Zimbabwe and China, it began many years ago, and some scholars claim that it began about 600 years ago between the Ming and Qing dynasties, which were in China, which came to trade with Zimbabwe, particularly the Munumtapa Empire in Zimbabwe about 600 years ago. And trade was basically mainly in textiles. And there's no recorded activity basically between 600 years ago and up to the 1960s when relations were re-established between China and the Zimbabwe Liberation Movement, particularly between China and the Zimbabwe African National Union Patriotic Front, ZANU-PF. And this was during the liberation struggle because China was quite instrumental, particularly in the provision of arms, military training to ZANU-PF's military wing at that time, which was called ZANLA, the Zimbabwe National Liberation Army. And according to Chan, it was giving unconditional military aid to ZANLA, and there was training of ZANLA in Maoist ideology, which was basically premised upon the teachings of Chairman Mao Zedong. So the Maoist ideology was quite unique from the Marxism, which was being propagated in Russia's Leninist Marxist state. So military training involved military science, it involved mass mobilization techniques, it involved guerrilla warfare, and the training that the ZANLA forces received from the Chinese in terms of military strategy and guerrilla warfare, it culminated in a radical transformation of the war effort. And this tilted the balance of the war effort, particularly in favor of Zimbabwe. And in 1980, Zimbabwe then gained her independence. So from then on, I'm going to then look at the establishment of formal diplomatic relations, because here I've been just looking at the establishment of relations between a liberation movement and China, which is basically the history or the context in which the Zimbabwe-China relations were established. So the first meeting between the former President Robert Mugabe and the Chinese officials was actually conducted in 1979, also coinciding coinciding with the negotiations at the Lancaster House Agreement between the British and the Zimbabweans, which then led to the independence of Zimbabwe. Formal diplomatic relations between China and Zimbabwe were established on 18 April 1980. And this is the same day, actually, that relations were also established with the United States of America. So the first official visit between Zimbabwe state officials to China after Zimbabwe's independence was made by the late Simon Muzenda, who was the former vice president of Zimbabwe, and then the deputy prime minister. He was also the deputy prime minister during 1980, and he went to thank China for the support they rendered during the liberation struggle. The following year, also, the first head of government, who was by then the Zimbabwean former Prime Minister Robert Mugabe, also then traveled to China to reinforce Muzenda's visit and to thank China for her camarade during the Second Chimrenga War from 1963 to 1979. And thereafter, there were a series of visits that actually took place between Zimbabwe and China, but mainly being Zimbabwe going to visit China in search of economic opportunities and aid. So Robert Mugabe made an official state visit again to China in 1985. He made another visit in 1987. He made another visit in 1993. And likewise, China then also sent their officials for China's first official visit in Zimbabwe. And this was in 1994 and 1995. Okay, so you can actually see that in terms of the visits, it was Zimbabwe that was visiting China more, seeking economic opportunities. But at that time, China was looking elsewhere because they were reconfiguring their own economy, and they basically were now adopting a more capitalist approach. So China was basically not interested in an ideological relationship, which Zimbabwe was interested in at that moment. But China was more interested in a business relationship with Zimbabwe, which explains why there was and this move by Zimbabwe to engage China, but at the same time, China seemed not to be interested. And according to several scholars, China focused its attention on investment opportunities, particularly which were coming from the US and other Western countries. So Zimbabwe had to look elsewhere for economic support in international relations. There's a saying from the realist perspective, which basically is premised upon that no country has permanent friends, but each country has permanent interest from the realist perspective. So Zimbabwe, having permanent interest, then had to look elsewhere for economic support. And according to scholars like Taylor, for instance, Zimbabwe received support from Sweden and other Western countries such as the USA, the UK, and it basically then adopted a capitalism for it to be accepted in the international community. And there was relief actually in the international community because Robert Mugabe was feared as a radical Marxist leader, and this change in behavior was welcomed, and he became a darling of the West. So in terms of development aid, Zimbabwe during the 1980s received a lot of aid. For instance, from the European Economic Community, it received about 156 million, from the US about 204 million, from the World Bank about 417 million. So you can actually see that Zimbabwe was getting quite a lot of support from the West and also from international financial institutions like the IMF and the World Bank. But when the Tiananmen Square incident occurred in 1989 in China, which involved the crackdown of the Chinese government on protesters, particularly student protesters, which were protesting for democratic governance in China. China began to seek African support, particularly at the United Nations General Assembly, so that it could avert resolutions that condemned the Tiananmen Square incident. And Zimbabwe was one of the countries that stood by China, and it led other countries in defending Chinese sovereignty from what it perceived as Western conceptions of human rights that basically were not in alignment with China's conception of human rights. So China rewarded Zimbabwe and other African countries, particularly in Southern Africa, for their support from 1989 to 1997 by a 431% increase in investments. And then let's look at the Look East policy, because during the 2000s, that's when the Look East policy then really took root. But there are scholars like, for instance, Hasu Patel, who basically claims that the Look East policy actually began in the 1990s. Particularly, he premises his analysis on the fact that the Look East policy began in 1992, actually, when Zimbabwe began to look for investments from China, because China basically was growing in importance and in significance as a world power, and its economy. It was one of the newly industrializing countries, and its economy was growing fast. So not only Zimbabwe, but other countries also began to basically look for more trade and investments from China as it was growing and expanding, and it was one of the Asian tigers that was doing quite well during that time. So the Look East policy basically came into being as a measure by the Zimbabwean government, particularly to avert the deteriorating relations that were existing between Zimbabwe and the UK, particularly over the land dispute, over human rights abuses. Also, the European Union also had sanctioned Zimbabwe in 2000 under the Cotonou Agreement. And we had also the ZIDERA, Zimbabwe Democracy Recovery Act, being enacted by the United States of America in 2001. Australia also then imposed sanctions, targeted measures, particularly among Zimbabwe's elites, particularly during the 2000s. So the Look East policy then coincided also with the suspension of Zimbabwe and its subsequent withdrawal from the Commonwealth in 2003. And therefore, Zimbabwe had to look elsewhere for other partners. And as a result, it then looked at China. So also the failure of neoliberal IMF and World Bank economic policies basically also then led to the adoption of the Look East policy. And the Look East policy, interestingly, it coincided with the establishment of the Forum on China-Africa Cooperation in 2000. And this also coincided with Zimbabwe's diplomatic standoff with the West, and provided the opportunity, the perfect opportunity for the close relations that China then began to enjoy with Zimbabwe. So the official Look East policy was adopted in 2003, as most scholars allude to. And it was a defining moment, particularly between China and Zimbabwe relations. Although it was adopted as a government policy in 2003, there was no official document, particularly which basically was adopted by the Zimbabwean government over the Look East policy, which led some scholars to basically call it a political statement. And faced with the hostile relations with Zimbabwe, with the West, Zimbabwe had to look east. And it basically focused primarily on countries like Singapore, Malaysia, Thailand, India, Pakistan, Indonesia, and Iran. But more emphasis was basically placed on China. Okay, so basically that was the Look East policy in terms of its conceptualization. So let's look at an overview of the aid, investments, and trade that are between Zimbabwe and China. Zimbabwe's investments and trade with China have grown significantly over the years, and from the period 2002 to 2013, investments grew to over 1.3 billion between China and Zimbabwe. But however, Zimbabwe has had a trade deficit with China. In 2008, the trade deficit was 189 million, but by 2019, it had grown to about 2.4 billion, and what explains this trade deficit is the fact that Zimbabwe is a major exporter of raw materials to China, particularly in the mineral sector. Zimbabwe is one of the largest producers of chrome. It's one of the it has the largest deposits of gold in the world. So Zimbabwe it exports chrome, it exports iron, it exports steel, platinum, tobacco, cotton, nickel, and ferroalloys. And Zimbabwe, as a net exporter of raw materials, means that it will remain a dependent nation, particularly on the Western industrialized states and also on China. And China imports mainly finished products to Zimbabwe in the form of clothing, in the form of textiles, footwear, cars, buses, tractors, aircraft, plastics, engine, motor spare parts, electrical gadgets, for instance. So China mainly exports finished products to Zimbabwe, whilst Zimbabwe exports raw materials, which explains the trade deficit that we have with China. In terms of investments from 2000 to 2017, China gave over 2 billion loans to Zimbabwe. And initially, Chinese investments were concentrated in the extractive sector, but they are now expanding into manufacturing, agriculture, retail, transport, and infrastructure projects. However, the Chinese control over 90% of Zimbabwe's mining industry. And China is one of the world's top chrome consumer, and Zimbabwe supplies over 60% in terms of chrome to China. In terms of development aid, China has been offering grants, it has been offering concessional loans, and it has also been making contributions to Zimbabwe to the World Food programs. And some scholars state that in exchange for loans, Zimbabwe has offered China gold, chrome, and platinum, virtually mortgaging Zimbabwe's minerals to China. In terms of humanitarian aid, because China has also been providing humanitarian aid of late, it has provided humanitarian aid to support the victims of Cyclone Idai. For instance, it donated about 800,000 US dollars in emergency humanitarian assistance to Zimbabwe after Cyclone Idai. It also provided a further 2 million for humanitarian assistance, and this was donated through UNICEF. And also the Chinese community living in Zimbabwe also then donated cooking oil, blankets, quilts, and 31,000 worth of goods that were donated to Zimbabwe. In terms of COVID-19 diplomacy, China has also been very forefront in terms of assisting Zimbabwe. It has assisted in the upgrade of the Wilkins Infectious Diseases Hospital. It has donated medical equipment, masks, over 166,000 face masks were donated, including gloves. 5 ventilators, for instance, were donated from the Embassy of the People's Republic of China. It also made a 3 million donation to UNICEF regarding Zimbabwe, and it also donated towards the refurbishing of neonatal clinics in southern and eastern Zimbabwe. In terms of cultural relations, we actually see that there's been an establishment, just like in most African countries, of a Confucius Institute in Zimbabwe, and it's centered at the University of Zimbabwe. It offers language training, translations, training, particularly in Shona, In Mandarin, for instance, there's been the production of Shona Chinese dictionaries, which have been provided by the center, and also the Dream Star competitions, which are held yearly, which are part of the Belt and Road initiative. And most of the finalists then go and travel to China so that they can also perform in China. And also in terms of the Chinese diaspora that is in Zimbabwe, we have over 10,000 Chinese nationals that are living and working in Zimbabwe. And in terms of the Zimbabweans that are living in China, we have over 5,000 Zimbabweans that are living in China. And in terms of the criticisms, basically that has been faced by most Chinese companies is that they've been criticized for human rights abuses, particularly the violation of workers' rights, for instance. Also, China has been criticized for the subjection of blacks to forced quarantines and testing for COVID-19 in China, which has gone viral. Of course, the Chinese government has excused itself from all of these allegations that have been made, and they've denied that such has been taking place. And also the Chinese have also made reports that they are being denied treatment for medical conditions in Zimbabwe, which are unrelated to coronavirus, and they are being verbally abused and physically abused by Zimbabweans in the streets. And I've already mentioned that we have over 5,000 Zimbabweans that are living in China, and those statistics are basically for the year 2019. And the Zimbabweans are involved basically in music, in art, in craft. They are teachers and translators. China has also been criticized for its non-interference policy, which has basically been favored by many countries that are violating human rights abuses. So China does not interfere in the internal affairs of countries, and this has been favored. And their loans do not have the conditionalities for democracy, observance of human rights that the West usually puts as demands for getting the loans to African countries. Also, China has also been criticized for siphoning Zimbabwe's resources without any technological or technical expertise or technological transfer to Zimbabweans. It has been also criticized for violating EMA regulations for environmental protection during prospecting and mining. So basically the Chinese companies that are in Zimbabwe have been criticized over human rights, over all of those allegations. And in conclusion, basically, after the Mnangagwa regime assumed power, what happened was that Mnangagwa went to China, and the two countries have elevated their relations from what they call a comradeship relationship, or what is called a party-party comradeship relationship, to what is called a comprehensive strategic cooperative partnership, which means that trade between Zimbabwe and China is going to continue, and it has grown since 2018 by 1.2 billion annually, with Zimbabwe continuing to export raw materials like tobacco, cotton, and various minerals. And Zimbabwe's failure to meet the re-engagement demands by the West have meant that the relations between China and Zimbabwe remain key for the foreseeable future, since they are the one partner that Zimbabwe has turned to in the face of deteriorating relations with the West, and they seem to be growing investments in China. They have cheaper loans, for instance, despite the criticisms that China then has over human rights abuses. So the key takeaway is that Zimbabwe and China basically need to engage more, and basically negotiate the terms that create a win-win partnership between the two countries. Thank you very much. Over to you, Bridget.
Thank you so much, Eve, for that very deep analysis of the political, economic, even development and humanitarian ties that exist between Zimbabwe and China. It seems like colleagues are bursting with questions and comments. Just a few of them here is that I'm going to read out before I actually bring some comments and specific targeted questions to our panelists. I'm having a comment here from Darlington, who was really enjoying the presentation by Xinjing because of the way that it was very clear and it outlined the mechanisms that are there. We also had another comment here where someone is asking, they don't understand why in what way the relations at the end of the day will benefit Zimbabwe. But I just want to bring these very directed questions back to you, the panelists. So just to give a rundown, first of all, we had an introduction by Mutuso, who was telling us about the research agenda and the need to create a network of practitioners who will begin to interrogate some of these issues on the accountability mechanisms. And then Veda went into the Belt and Road initiatives. You know, she told us what it's about and how it's structured, basically. And we then went into a discussion where we were looking at the legal structures that are in place, and Xinjing talked about the courts that are there and what mechanisms they are. And now, Eve, you've just come in and sort of sealed it at the back to discuss Zimbabwe-China relations, what the position is. These are dating back years and years, and now they've essentially been cemented. So the question arises, really, the question that everybody is asking themselves, and even us as community members, as citizens of this country, of Africa, of the region, are asking ourselves in terms of what it is that this relationship means, you know? I have a question here, and I believe that it was targeted to Xinjing. And you had mentioned, Xinjing, that you would answer this question later on in the question and answer session. And I just want you to say, to speak to this issue that Mr. Sunguro is asking, what do you think is contributing to the industrial disharmony in the mining sector specifically? And what could be the way forward to address the challenges? He also speaks about whether or not this legal mechanism involves labor and environmental injustice issues. Can you comment on that, Xinjing?
Yes, for sure. If you look at Chinese companies' behaviors in Africa, you can see there's some difference between them and the Western-based multinationals, and those behaviors you can trace back to the environment, the business environment back in China. So in China, we don't, for years, we don't have a civil society organizations which can hold those Chinese companies accountable, and the community have no means to hold those companies accountable. Those, especially the SOEs, they are in an environment, in favorable environment. They can do whatever they want, and so there is no strong civil society organization, and no strong environment regulation. I mean, a couple of years or some years ago, like in 1990s, and that led to China's environment, the severe environment crisis, because all those Chinese companies are not following the environment regulations. And so looking back where they came from, those Chinese companies, you will understand why they are doing the same thing in your country. And so that is the question is you have to look at the parent company and their environment, the legal environment and the political environment, where they came from. And in Zimbabwe, if you have a strong law and regulation like Canada, the US, Chinese company will tend to behave better. But if your institution is weak, and those companies, include Western company, they will take advantage of your weak institutions, and they will take advantage of your weak compliance of laws and enforcement of laws. And that is a problem we have to solve on both sides. The problem we need in strings, the regulation, the management in China, and you in Zimbabwe, in Africa, and your institution, like the rule of law, judiciary, and all those mechanisms should be in strings together, so you can be resistant, your country can be resistant to all those investment, no matter from China and from US and from Europe, which will cause harm to your community. So the bar needed to be raised from both sides. That is the harmony, where harmony could come from. And we need strings, the regulation, the governance from both sides, from the China and Africa together. So that is my question. Where is the hope? Yes, I think we see the global trend to hold the multinationals accountable, include those the mining companies, those giant mining extractive the companies in oil industry and other minerals. And that trend, I think, will put pressure on Chinese company. They are in the same international business environment. The pressure put on the shell, they will have an impact on the other multinational corporations. So that is a hope. I think we will need to work together and to cross a boundary, cross jurisdiction, and hold those multinational accountable. And that is the action we need to take. And we also need a stronger overarching international legal system, and which put a requirement on those multinationals, include Chinese companies.
Thank you so much, Xinjing. I have another question here that was directed to you. So yeah, you're saying that it's our weak institutional and weak legal systems that need to be engaged as well. So another question here is coming from Farai, where he's talking about, is there an opportunity for civil society organizations to directly engage with Chinese financial institutions that are financing some of the projects in Africa?
As I mentioned, there's only one China-based financial institution, AIIB, Asian Infrastructure Industry Bank, has provided a channel for civil society to engage. No other Chinese banks open their doors to affected community in Zimbabwe or in along the BRI countries. But that's it. You still have an opportunity to engage the embassies through the embassy, Chinese embassy in your country, and to reach out to the Chinese company. It's not easy road to take because I know the Chinese embassy may not take your calls and respond to you, but that is I think the one option you can do, and reach out to the Chinese banks directly, and though they may not respond to you directly. So that is a unfortunate fact. We don't Chinese banks, unlike the World Bank groups, they don't provide that channel for civil society organizations to directly engaging with them. You have to find a way, other ways. I'm happy to talk about the case by case. Sometimes it's hard to generalize what avenue you can use, but the case by case, we could find some way to reach out to Chinese stakeholders.
I agree with you on that one, because recently we have seen a case where a coalition basically lobbied a funder to then actually refuse funding for a Zimbabwean coal-fired project, a proposed coal-fired project. So that's a very interesting mechanism there. There's another question here from Mr. Ndlovu, who is asking you, Xinjing, he wants to know, on the Chinese investment track record from a comparative perspective. He's saying that we've seen that Chinese investments are always followed by allegations of human rights violations in Zimbabwe. Is this the general trend elsewhere, or is this just for here?
Yeah, I think it's better not to generalize this. A Chinese company is always associated with the human rights violation. You see case by case. You see some cases in Latin America, in Asia, in Africa. But you can. It's better not to generalize to say China is violating. So China is a big concept. Under this name, there are Chinese government, Chinese state-owned enterprise, Chinese private companies, individual Chinese businessmen, and there are many stakeholders under the same name, China. So I couldn't see. I have been seeing some severe human rights violation associated with the Chinese companies in cross continents and in Africa and in Latin America. But I wouldn't say it's just China, associated with human rights violation. Yeah, as I mentioned in the early answer, Chinese company do have this trend. If you compare with them with Western-based company, it does have a weaker environment performance and weaker the capacity or willingness to communicate with affected community nearby. And they are not transparent. They are not willing to communicate with the civil society organization. That is a fact. I have been seeing that a lot in many countries.
Okay, thanks a lot, Xinjing. So without wasting too much time, because I'm seeing that we're running out of time, I want to hand over to Veda. Veda, you have a question to clarify here in the chat box, where someone was asking, China has been siphoning minerals illegally through use of equipment that are not strong, and on exporting for repairs, they steal minerals as well. I guess this is just a comment. But then the one that I was actually referring to, sorry, I read the wrong comment, was relating to debts and how Veda was speaking about the debts and what it is that she really wanted to clarify on whether or not she was justifying those debts. Veda, over to you.
Thank you, Bridget. So yes, thank you for bringing that up. I think it's a point that definitely needs to be clarified. So what I was saying is that there is a case to be made that debt is necessary to fuel growth. So some African economists and scholars that I've spoken to argue that there is a need for infusion of foreign capital for development. But it is very worrisome that China is Africa's largest bilateral creditor. It holds at least 21% of African debt, amounting to over $150 billion. So while a small percentage of this has been waived, China scholars state that the case of outright relief may be impossible. Instead, it is more likely that the loan payments will be postponed, debt will be restructured, or even some argue a debt equity swap of some sort. For example, in Ethiopia in 2018, we saw that China agreed to restructure debt, including the $4 billion loan for the Addis-Djibouti Railway, and extended the repayment terms by 20 years. But what I was really trying to underline was that African countries have considerable sway while negotiating deals with China. And I really want to underline this, right? That African support is vital for the success of the BRI. It is vital. The vocal support of African leaders are critical to offset the many criticisms leveled against the initiative and to further the narrative of what I call the benign BRI. So as scholars and as experts, all of us here today, I think it is vital to equip and inform African policymakers to help negotiate better deals, more sustainable deals, especially in light of the impact of COVID-19. I just wanted to clarify that. Thanks for the opportunity, Bridget.
Thanks, Veda. So while we have you on, because you spoke about the BRI, there's a question here from Owen where he's saying, why is the practice that Chinese are major shareholders in the Zimbabwean mining sector? Probably it's also something that Xinjing can speak to. Is it part of the strategy to take on the shareholding, or perhaps it's part of that debt equity swap, which is a technical arrangement that I'm sure some people here would need some explaining about. But why is that? Is it part of the strategy?
I think I'm going to let Xinjing take this, but a quick comment on this. I think, again, like she mentioned, it's very important that we don't generalize China, right? Because who is China? And if you look at the loan contracts of many of these projects, each of these contracts by sector, by country are very different. So again, I would resist from making the generalization, and I'm going to leave it to Xinjing to make an expert comment.
Yeah, the reason I think the reason it's not a strategy. We talk about the BRI, you may thought there is an overall strategy to put each Chinese company in this in one country or one sector. No, we don't have such a strategy. BRI is a huge concept, and like the basket, you can put everything in politics, economy, investment, trade to that basket. And there is no any standard to see for the Chinese company to claim they are qualified BRI project. So before the PBRI, I mentioned the Go Global, Go Out policy, which was announced in the year of 2000. It was for a Chinese company to pursue to bring back the natural resource to fuel China's domestic economy. So it's probably, I think, the primary reason is the profit and the need from Chinese domestic economy. And you see, China has had a rapid development in the past 30 years, and it needs natural resource. And naturally, the Chinese company have been pursuing those natural resources globally. And that phenomenon was reinforced by the BRI. And you see more and more investment from China to the extractive industry globally, because China needs those natural resources. That is the reason. As I'm not economist, but as this is my common sense, what I have been saying. You see, there are some Chinese private companies. They are in this extractive industry. I don't think that they are implementing China's any kind of policy. They are just pursuing their own profits. They find profit and their needs. And you see the Chinese, the biggest investment in Guinea. It's a private Chinese company from Shandong province. There are many Chinese private companies. They are not implementing China's policy, but they are driven by the profit, the need.
If I may just sort of add to that, Bridget.
Go ahead, Bridget.
Not exactly to this point, but I think that an interesting comparison was when we spoke to Chinese managers who were working on projects that were funded by China Exim, and other Chinese contractors who were working on projects funded by the World Bank, right? And it was very interesting to us that the Chinese contractors working on the World Bank project sort of were telling us that there were so many more safeguards in place, so many more routes that they had to take, so many more steps involved. For instance, they had to make sure that all of the staff had a changing room. They had to make sure certain types of training was provided. They had to make sure a certain degree of safety equipment was provided. And they kind of, I got the sense that they saw these as, unnecessary frills attached to increasing the cost. But it also sort of underlined the fact that the demand and the request made by host countries was very critical in drawing out the kind of investments you wanted. I just sort of wanted to underline that. So the same companies are building the same things, and yet the way they operate is different because of the demand by the host financier or the host country. So that just brings me back to the main point. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you so much for clarifying that, Veda. There are a few comments here, such as the one from Christabel, where she was talking about, I'm worried about the fate of our future generations because of, we need to foster these sustainable relations. But at the end of the day, you're saying it falls back to us as a country. What is it that we have in place and what is it that we bring to the table when we're negotiating? So I just want to jump right now to Eve. Eve spoke very, very detailed account of Zim-Sino relations, and she spoke about the mortgaging or the perceived mortgaging of minerals. And there's a question here from Unifa who's talking about, are the loans from China worth mortgaging with minerals of an unknown value? Obviously, this is very technical, but Eve, I just wanted you to expound more on that aspect in terms of what exactly is the nature of this mortgaging, in quotes, and what is it that can be done? Is Zimbabwe not better off processing its own minerals and exporting value-added processed minerals?
Thank you very much, Bridget, for that question. It's very difficult really to tell. These are thoughts that scholars have really put forward, that China is virtually mortgaging the resources of African countries, not only Zimbabwe, but of African countries. But then there's the question that is Zimbabwe not better off? Mining its own minerals, but then that comes in the question of do we have the technical expertise, for instance, to do it on our own? For instance, do we have the resources to do it on our own? And in international relations, no country can really be an autarky. We cannot be isolated. We need to trade with other countries. And like what Veda has said, there are other countries that are putting in legislative mechanisms to ensure that, for instance, they protect the environment, they protect their people in terms of human rights abuses. So I think that we need to go to the negotiating table and really negotiate, because these are our resources, and our constitution basically is premised upon the fact that the burden and the benefits of resources must be shared equally between present and future generations. So it is up to us as Zimbabweans, and our government recently launched the 12 billion mining vision to be achieved in 2023, which is quite commendable. But then there's need for transparency also and accountability in the management of these resources, because there's been a lot of corruption. For instance, the 15 billion that was being alluded to in the chat box of missing diamond revenue, for instance. There's a lot of corruption that has been happening. And I think that if we adopt, for instance, the AITI a global standard, it will also then help us also in beneficial ownership, in then knowing who owns what, and also making them accountable to the government. For instance, most of these Chinese companies are not also paying taxes, for instance, to local authorities or royalties, for instances. So there's basically the need for our government then to reform also our Mines and Minerals Act, so that, for instance, this also then benefits the resources, benefits the Zimbabweans themselves and the local communities. They also then develop from the mining ventures that are actually taking place, and future generations also can then benefit if we are then being responsible in terms of managing our resources and avoiding resource-backed loans, so that we are able then to manage our resources. And also the aspect of debt, which was basically alluded to by Veda in a presentation, then becomes quite important, because a lot of these debts are actually being basically incurred, and our resources are being then mortgaged in exchange of debt repayment. So we need to manage our debt sustainably. For instance, Zimbabwe has over 8 billion. It owes over 8 billion in terms of external debt, and in terms of domestic debt, we have over 12.5 billion that we owe. So we need to manage our debt, and we are on the verge actually of being in a debt trap, and the IMF has described Zimbabwe as a country in debt distress. So in terms of the debt, we need to make sure that it is at sustainable levels. We need to also then make sure that if we receive the resources in terms of loans, in terms of grants, we manage them transparently and accountability. And civil society also then has a role in for instance, as watchdogs. For instance, to keep on pressuring government, to keep on advocating for adoption of better monitoring mechanisms that ensure that the resources benefit present and future generations. Thank you, Bridget.
Thanks a lot, Eve. I think there's a lot to unpack there when it comes to the mortgaging of natural resources. So the African Institute of Environmental Law is currently doing, some research on this, and they did a paper on resource mortgaging in the context of COVID-19. It's going to be published under the University of Pretoria, and I'm sure they'll share that with us as soon as it's available, because it will speak to some of the very technical issues and how this actual mortgaging happens. So there's a question here from Ms. Gutu. Mrs. Gutu is saying the Chinese have also made huge investments in the coal sector in Zimbabwe. Did the research deliberately avoid looking at this sector? And by research, I believe that she's referring to the research that you, Eve, and Mutuso were part of.
I can speak to it, Bridget. Yeah, so yes, true that indeed the Chinese have made huge investments in terms of the coal sector. I think when you go to Hwange today, that is very evident. But for this research, the focus was on those other three minerals, which are chrome, gold, and diamonds. And as we pointed out, this is the first of many researches that the Zimbabwe Environmental Law Association is commissioned through the African Institute for Environmental Law. So yes, I think that's a valid point that we can look into in terms of the other forthcoming research that may be coming. We'll look into that as well. So I think for a start, we started with these three minerals, but I think this is a program that is ongoing. And I'm sure that as we progress with the researches, I think those are other minerals that can also be targeted. But for the time being, for this research, it was basically those three minerals and development finance as well. And I would also want to speak generally to some of the issues that have been raised by the participants. I think both Veda and Xinjing have been very clear that in terms of some of these issues that we are raising, first and foremost, we are the ones that are actually there to blame, to be honest. So I think just like anyone, the Chinese have their own interests, and we also have our own interests. So when these negotiations are done, the biggest question is, what are we doing as Zimbabweans to make sure that we further our own interests? Because if they've pointed out, these same Chinese companies go to America, go to Europe, and does investment. Why is it that it is working in those countries, but when it comes here, we see it as problematic? Maybe it's the framework that we are using in terms of engaging them to do the negotiations, and also our laws and policies as well, and the lack of enforcement. So I don't think that it would be proper to put all the blame on them to say they are not respecting our Environmental Management Act, or that they are not respecting our Constitution. If they are not, what mechanisms are there for us to hold them accountable at the local level, at the national level, at the regional level, and also at the international level has been shared. So to a large extent, I think we need to begin to shift that debate to really understand it, to say, what can we do better? And I think Veda was very clear that there are opportunities in BRI, but it all depends on how we are able to utilize those opportunities and what we can do to make sure that the BRI works to our favor. So at the moment, I think the biggest challenge that we are seeing is that, one, we negotiate poorly. I think someone said, when we negotiate, we are deaf, dumb, and blind. So if you put that chemistry together, deaf, dumb, and blind, then you can begin to understand what kind of negotiation that you are going to have there. And it's a pity, because when you look at the African Development Bank, there's a facility there that can actually help African governments to negotiate better with these investors. But just do an analysis to see how many countries have actually been able to utilize that facility. None. And people are happy to do their own negotiations because maybe that give them opportunities for patronage issues, opportunities for corruption. So I think some of these challenges, so take for example, the failure to reform the Mines and Minerals Act. Who do we blame there? We are using an outdated piece of legislation. Our failure to adopt the Extractive Industry Transparency Initiative, our failure, for example, to use the Africa Mining Vision in terms of the reforms of our laws and policies. And are we all putting that blame on the investors? So I think for me, when you look at the Chinese, just like any other investor, they're looking for opportunities, and the onus is on us to negotiate better, to engage better, to hold them accountable. So we can't give that responsibility or say that that responsibility should be taken by someone else. So I think in as much as we think that there are problems that are there in terms of Chinese investors, which are very clear in terms of these researches that have been done. But I think what we also need to begin to think about is, where are we getting it wrong in terms of negotiations? Where are we getting it wrong in terms of our law enforcement? Where are we getting it wrong in terms of our ability to make sure that these investments work in our favor? So I think if we can begin to change that narrative, then we can begin to mobilize, we can begin to organize, and also engage better and also negotiate better, so that we are able to derive value from these resources, so that as these investors come on board, they're able to respect our laws and policies. Because if we don't and expect other people to do it on our behalf, then I think that's where the problem lies. So for me, I'm happy that these conversations are beginning to open us to some of those avenues that are there, that we can actually use to make sure that we engage better, to make sure that we hold them accountable where the violations have been done. Because if they do it in America, they'll be held accountable. So I think those are some of the things that we need to begin to reflect on as CSOs and as communities that are working in this sector, to make sure that the investments work in our favor. Thank you.
Maybe I'll just fill in the time, because she did point out one of the questions that was asked to me, which is, among the countries, African countries signed on the BRI, which countries have negotiated better? So I think this is a broad question. And I think given, the secrecy behind the negotiations and the fact that very rarely do we see the loan contracts themselves, it's a little difficult to answer. But I think some of the pointers that we've sort of seen is that, some of these countries have been able to use different tools to sort of gain leverage in these negotiations. For instance, Djibouti, when you look at how it negotiates with China, it uses its strategic location, at the crossroads of Africa and the Middle East, to sort of, offer China an opportunity to sort of gain influence in the region. Similarly, you also see Ethiopia, using its strategic position to sort of, use that as a tool while they negotiate. But I think what has been really interesting for me to see is, there are certain countries like Benin, Botswana, Liberia, Senegal, Sierra Leone, who use technical departments to manage the negotiations with Chinese entities. So the presidency sort of takes, a back seat. And then I think in Cote d'Ivoire, that in 2018, they were negotiating a $580 million hydropower project. And in that project, and they too used a technical department to manage the negotiations, and only 20% of the workforce on that project was Chinese. And almost all of the building materials were sourced locally. And they also conceded that the working language on the project would be French. And similarly, in Liberia, I've read that all contracts are outsourced to an independent international accounting firm. So this sort of discourages, unnecessary high-level interference from other parties. And I think it's also really interesting here, and I think Mutuso can attest to this. I also remember reading that in Zimbabwe, the government had banned coal mining in the Hwange National Park after protests. And the campaign for this was led by Zela, which lodged an appeal at the Harare High Court. So I think there are many instances where either you've used your geopolitical, the tools at your disposal, either the geography or your history or your relationships with other countries, or you've used technical negotiating teams. Also, just to add, another official at Kenya had told me that they hire lawyers from Singapore to negotiate with the Chinese. In Tanzania, I was told that consulting lawyers from Germany would step in for negotiations. So in places where, either to boost their own technical capacities, external parties were brought in. So you see very different tools being used to sort of try and strike the best deals in these projects, which, some of them go on for years, and the impact of these projects will not be known for decades to come. So in these cases, you sort of see these smart tools being employed.
Thanks, Veda. So we are running out of time, but I just have one more round of questions here. So there's this question that was put here by Tafadzwa, and he's asking Eve specifically. He's saying that it's in the public domain that Zimbabwe is benefiting from Sino-Zim relations in the form of generous donations, and you highlighted this. So what is China benefiting in return? Is this information also publicly available? Yeah, I think he's alluding to that lack of transparency there. So Eve, if you could quickly pick that up.
Yes, it's true that the Chinese are benefiting quite a lot, and I've mentioned it actually in my presentation what they are benefiting. I said Zimbabwe basically is an exporter of raw materials. We export unprocessed products, whilst China then exports to us finished products. So they are benefiting quite a lot in terms of trade. For instance, they have a huge economy, for instance, and China is one of the biggest consumers of chrome in the world. They are an expanding economy. So they are basically benefiting from most of the resources that we have, particularly our minerals. They have invested in the manufacturing sector. And so they are benefiting quite a lot in terms of our natural resources. That's what I can say. Thank you.
Right. Thanks a lot, Eve. And then I think we have one more last question, which I'm not sure who's going to take it, but it's from Blessed. And he's saying that if you say there are no mechanisms to hold these companies accountable for their bad actions, it means that there is no promotion of the principle of sustainable development, as these investors can do damage to the environment to any extent they wish. I guess it's partly pointed to Xinjing because she was talking about the legal mechanisms, and also partly pointed to Mtuso because he was speaking about the local context and the need for regulatory oversight there. So Xinjing or Mtuso, you can go ahead.
Okay. So what I meant to say is we haven't filed any case across we call the transnational cases to hold Chinese company accountable and the Chinese courts, which doesn't mean there is no cases in Africa, in Zimbabwe, other country with aim to hold Chinese investment accountable. But I did say the cases in Ghana, cases in Kenya, which the community won the case and stopped the coal plants in Namu in Kenya. And there are many cases, ongoing cases all across the globe. And that is the way we are using our domestic legal system. The host country, which received Chinese investment, use their own court to hold the Chinese company accountable. But the result depends on whether you have strong laws, strong judiciary, and strong civil society organizations. And that is what Mtuso, I think, Zela has been doing to use your own legal system to hold all kinds of multinationals accountable, not only China, include other multinationals from other countries.
Okay, yeah. Thanks, Xinjing. Mtuso, do you have any comment there?
Sure, I do have. So yes, the mechanisms are there, Bridget and other listeners. If you look at the Environmental Management Act, you look at the various laws that we have, you look at the Constitution, I think the mechanisms are there. The question is, are they being utilized? And of course, some of the challenges that may actually come whenever these are being utilized, I think the so-called political interference, corruption, and all those other things. And I think as Zela, one of our strategies is litigation, and we've actually litigated. I think people have cited the Wange case and many other cases as well where we have actually litigated and have been able to get remedy. So I think for me, it shows that there are a number of strategies that we can actually use. I think we can't say that there is one strategy that is a silver bullet in terms of addressing some of these challenges, but it's a number of strategies that needs to be used. It could be advocacy itself. It could be legal reforms to make sure that our laws are strengthened. Of course, there's also the litigation that can also be used. So I think those mechanisms are there at the local level, at the national level. If you look at our courts, then you can also begin to look at the regional level. I think there are also mechanisms that are there, and the continental level, and of course, the other one that have just been outlined by Xinjing. So the mechanisms are there. Of course, there could be weakness, yeah, definitely, because having mechanisms is one thing, but making sure that they are effective is another thing. So in my own opinion, the mechanisms are there, but whether they've got loopholes that can be utilized either from a political point of view or from a technical point of view, of course, those are there. And those are the issues that we may need to focus on in terms of legal reforms and all those other things. But I think the starting point is that they are there and we should be able to utilize them. And this is the very essence of some of these conversations that we're having, for us to have that understanding to say what mechanisms are there and how best can we utilize them. And if there are weaknesses, then I think there are parliamentarians here. We do some of those advocates to have reforms so that they're basically strengthened. It could be some of the penalties that are weak and deterrent and not deterrent. Maybe that's something that we need to focus on. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you so much for clarifying that, Mtuso. There's also a comment here that, Parliament needs to be capacitated to scrutinize the Chinese agreements or really any other international agreement before they are, put in effect. So basically, they need to be ratified by Parliament, and there's also need for renegotiation of some of these deals. So I guess there's work there to be done. And again, another comment which is talking about the special attention that should be given to the bilateral relations between Zimbabwe and China. So colleagues, I just want to say, thank you so much for the comments. There are a lot. Please keep them coming, and the questions as well. Our panelists will try to engage you directly, or you might get answers from Zela if you provide your email address. And again, to remind that this is a series of dialogues. It's the first of many. So I just want to say thank you, first of all, to Xinjing for her wonderful, insightful presentation on the legal aspects and that mechanism that can be used. And then I want to say thank you again to Veda, who gave us an overview of what this thing is, what is the nature of this creature called the Belt and Road Initiative. And then we got that detailed discussion from Eve, where she gave us the history and the analytical perspective when it comes to the morphing of the political, economic, and even humanitarian relations that are there. So I just want to ask you, Mtuso, to close this session off by giving us really an indication of what it is that this series is trying to achieve and what we can look forward to in the next session. Over to you, Mtuso or Farai. Thank you.
I'll hand over to Farai.
Thank you so much, Bridget, for the great moderation, and many thanks to our speakers and our participants, I think, for making time for this very important and timely discussion. So I think the way forward, I would like to respond to Mr. Mazan. I think we are organizing some trainings for Parliament. The good thing we have resources. I think you could tell that Xinjing, Veda, Eve, Mtuso, they are great resources to take advantage of. So I think we'll get in touch bilaterally on that. So the next dialogue is on the 28th of July on the same platform, the PEDNARG platform. We'll reach out to you guys and sustain the narrative on how can we foster corporate accountability of Chinese investors going forward. So I think from us, thank you so much. Let's keep the conversations going. And I think, ciao, asante sana, till we meet next time. Thanks, Bridget.
Thank you so much, Farai. Xinjing, can you please just give a word of goodbye?
Thank you, everyone. Thank you for your question. And I'm very happy to have this opportunity to discuss the work. And I sincerely hope we can work together and hold all those multinationals accountable for their the environment, the human rights violation in your country, and improve your legal system. And that is as environmental lawyer, my work is not for working for the targeted on one Chinese, one actor, China, and I want to protect our whole planet. And thank you, and hope to see you again next time.
Thank you so much, Xinjing. Veda, any last words?
Yes, I'd just like to thank, first of all, the audience for coming and for being so engaged and asking pretty complicated, difficult questions and putting us on the spot. But I also really want to congratulate Zela on the handbook. I've had firsthand experience seeing how the team has worked very diligently, and especially during COVID, to go to these mining communities and hold focus group discussions and individual interviews while having all the safeguards in place. So Zela's commitment to understanding this very complicated issue and is completely commendable. And as somebody who's been studying this for the last few years, I'm glad that I was able to be part of this panel. And I look forward to more conversations on this. And I'd just like to wish everybody a very good day. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Veda. Eve, last but definitely not least, can you please go ahead and give your last words?
Thank you very much. I would like to give my last words by quoting Julius Nyerere. And he once said that we are the only continent that buys at the price that is determined by the seller and sells at the price that is determined by the buyer. And that is basically I'm answering a question here of someone who was basically saying what is to be done in terms of improving our Sino-Zimbabwe relations. We have also to be the determiners of the prices of our own commodities. And we can only do that when we value add our minerals, when we value add our resources, so that we also have negotiating power at the international platform. Thank you very much for this wonderful opportunity, and we look forward to engaging more. Thank you.
That was one of the political economy dialogues on natural resource governance, PEDNAG, brought to you by the Zimbabwe Environmental Law Association, Zela, and the African Institute for Environmental Law. For more information, please check out www.zela.org or follow the African Institute for Environmental Law on Twitter at AIEL_info. Stay tuned for more episodes.